The Cursed Clutch. The Imperial hatchery of Veilthorn had not seen a live hatching in 47 years, and the silence of that record pressed down on every stone of the mountain like a held breath that had forgotten how to release itself. Emperor Sorthix the Eternal, sovereign of the Draconic Imperium and ruler of 11 mountain provinces, stood before the glass-encased clutch of 6 dragon eggs with an expression that no courtier in 3 centuries of service had ever learned to read. His scales, black as obsidian freshly split from the earth and threaded throughout with veins of living gold that pulsed faintly with his heartbeat, caught the torchlight and scattered it in pieces across the hatchery walls. He had folded his enormous wings against his back with the rigid, deliberate control of a creature suppressing every outward sign of what it was feeling, and the effort of that suppression was the only thing in the room more visible than the dying glow of his eggs. They were his, the first clutch he had produced in 3 centuries of life, 3 centuries of war and governance, and the particular loneliness of outliving everything you had ever known, and they were dying in front of him, and he could not go near them. Every dragon who approached the clutch screamed. Not from pain precisely, though pain was part of it. From wrongness, a bone-deep, biology-deep wrongness that hit draconic nervous systems like a blade drawn slowly across the inside of the skull. Elder dragons, creatures who had survived wars and volcanic eruptions and the collapse of 2 previous imperial dynasties, fainted within seconds of proximity to the eggs. Younger ones wept blood from their ears and did not understand why, only that they needed to be very far away immediately. The imperial physician, a 700-year-old dragon of extraordinary renown whose calm under pressure was legendary throughout the 11 provinces, had lasted exactly 12 seconds inside the hatchery before collapsing against the doorframe and refusing, with a dignity that somehow survived his evident terror, to go near them again under any circumstances up to and including imperial execution. "They are cursed, your radiance," the physician had said, from the respectful distance of the antechamber, still trembling in the fine-boned way that very old dragons trembled when their composure had been comprehensively destroyed. "The resonance inside those shells is unlike anything recorded in our archives. Whatever frequency the hatchlings are emitting, it is antithetical to our kind. It is as though the sound of them is a language our bodies understand and cannot survive hearing." "They are alive," Sorithix had replied. His voice had carried the quiet, terrible calm of a creature who had watched civilizations rise and find their edges and crumble, who had learned across 3 centuries that the only tone of voice worth using in moments of catastrophe was the one that acknowledged the catastrophe without surrendering to it. "For now," the physician had said softly, "your radiance for now." That had been 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks of standing at the threshold and watching, because watching was the only thing left that didn't make it worse. The eggs were dimming, the luminescence that healthy dragon eggs maintained in their final weeks, a soft, internal glow like banked coals under silk, warm and alive and constant, was fading by increments that were visible to anyone willing to look long enough and honest enough to admit what they were seeing, without nest tending. Without warmth regulation and the careful monitoring of shell humidity and the specific low-frequency vibrations that parent dragons instinctively produce to communicate safety and presence to their unborn young, without all of it, the clutch was failing in a silence that Sorithix was not allowed to fill. He stood at the threshold every day and watched his children dim, and for the first time in 300 years of life he found himself without a solution, without a next move, without the particular cold clarity that had always served him in crises. He stood at the edge of what he could do and stared across the gap at what needed to be done, and the gap did not close. It was Thessavorn who suggested the solution, or rather, who raised it so delicately, so carefully, so thoroughly wrapped in the language of theoretical possibility and mere consideration, that it barely registered as a suggestion at all. Thessavorn was old enough and wise enough and had served long enough to understand that the Emperor of the Draconic Imperium was not a creature to whom one simply said, "I think we should ask a human for help," and then waited calmly for the response. "There are humans in the lower provinces," Thessavorn had said, his eyes fixed carefully on the middle distance, his tone that of a being conducting a purely academic exercise. "They have been tending livestock for generations, animals, difficult animals, unpredictable ones with biology that does not respond to reason or command. Their own biology is," he had searched for a word, turning several over and discarding them, "considerably simpler than ours, less resonant. Less attuned to the frequencies that govern draconic communication." He had paused. "It is possible, purely theoretically, that whatever the eggs are emitting would not register to a human nervous system the way it registers to ours, that they might be able to approach, to tend." Sorithix had said nothing for a very long time, long enough that the room's temperature dropped 3 degrees, which was what happened when he went very still. "Find me one," he said finally, "find me the best one they have." They found Marin Ashvale in a village so small it did not appear on any imperial map, kneeling in a pen of churned mud with a goat's broken foreleg braced between her knees and her entire attention focused on the slow, careful work of setting the bone correctly. She was 26 years old, and she was in the way of people who have done hard physical work their entire lives, unremarkable until you looked at her hands, which were calloused and certain, and her eyes, which were brown and steady and held the particular quality of patience that cannot be taught, the kind that gets worn into a person by years of dealing with creatures that are frightened and in pain and cannot explain either, and that require you to understand them anyway. She had copper-brown hair pulled back from her face with the efficiency of someone who had stopped thinking about their hair some years ago. There was a permanent crease between her brows from years of squinting into weather. There was mud on her boots and on her forearms and on one cheekbone where she had pushed her hair back without noticing her hands. She looked, in sum, like exactly nothing that the 3 Imperial soldiers standing at the fence of the pen had expected to find at the end of their search for the best animal caretaker in the lower provinces. The goat, for its part, had stopped struggling with the resigned philosophical acceptance of an animal that has decided, after a period of undignified protest, that this particular human is unfortunately trustworthy and that fighting her is a waste of energy it needs for recovery. It lay still and let her work, which the soldiers privately found more impressive than anything else they had seen that day. "The Emperor's hatchery," Marin repeated. She did not look up from the leg. "He wants a goat keeper." "A caretaker," the lead soldier said, with the stiff dignity of someone who felt the distinction was important. "The matter is of imperial urgency." "Are his eggs sick?" The 3 soldiers exchanged glances that contained everything she needed to know. She finished setting the leg with the unhurried focus of someone who had decided the task in her hands would be completed correctly before any other task was considered, regardless of urgency or rank. She wrapped it with practiced economy, not slow, not fast, right? And then she stood and wiped her hands on her work trousers and looked at the soldiers with those steady brown eyes and said, "Right, I'll need my kit." She did not ask whether she could refuse. She had grown up under the draconic Imperium. She understood the geometry of that question already. But neither did she seem afraid, which the soldiers noted with the slight unease that people in positions of authority tend to feel when faced with someone who has simply decided that fear is not a useful response to this particular situation. The journey to the Imperial Mountain took 2 days along roads that climbed from the agricultural lowlands into the cold, clear air of the high passes, and Marin spent most of it asking questions. She asked about the eggs, how many, how old, when the problem had first been noticed. She asked about symptoms, what exactly happened when dragons approached, how quickly, whether there was variation between individuals. She asked about interventions, what had been tried, in what order, with what results. The soldiers answered in clipped, uncomfortable fragments, partly because they were not entirely certain what they were authorized to disclose, and partly because the questions were more specific and more technically informed than they had expected, which was disorienting in the way that most disorienting things are. It made them feel that they had been operating on an assumption that turned out to be wrong. She listened the way she listened to everything, completely, with the whole of her attention, filing each fragment into whatever internal system she used to organize information, her brown eyes steady and her expression giving nothing away except that she was thinking. When they arrived at the hatchery and she stepped through the mountain entrance into the corridor that led toward the imperial nest, she felt it immediately, the first breath of whatever the eggs were emanating, a vibration that lived below the threshold of hearing, but well within the threshold of feeling, like standing in the shadow of a very large bell that had just been struck. It moved through her chest and settled in her back teeth and behind her eyes with a pressure that was distinctly unpleasant, and she stopped walking for a moment. The soldiers stopped behind her, watching with poorly concealed anxiety. Marin stood in the corridor and breathed slowly and assessed what she was feeling with the same systematic attention she brought to everything else. Not pain, exactly, pressure. An uncomfortable, sustained pressure that required acknowledgement and then management. She had worked through worse. She had worked through a dislocated shoulder once and a broken finger twice and a bull elk's antler across the ribs that had left a bruise the shape of a continent for 3 weeks. She had a high tolerance for managing discomfort long enough to finish what she had started. "Interesting," she said, which was the entirety of her response, and walked forward. Emperor Sorathix met her in the antechamber outside the hatchery. He was so large that the vaulted ceiling, built to accommodate the full wingspans of draconic nobility, and decorated with mosaics that had taken 37 artisans 16 years to complete, gave him barely sufficient clearance. He had the compressed quality of something enormous trying to take up less space than it naturally occupied, and not entirely succeeding. His scales caught the lamplight the same way they caught torchlight and every other kind of light, consuming some of it, fracturing the rest, making the shadows in the room shift and deepen around him as he breathed. His golden eyes, each one roughly the size of Marin's entire head, looked down at her with an expression of extraordinary complexity. It was the expression of a being who had never, in 3 centuries of absolute authority, found himself in the position of needing something from a creature so far beneath him in every measurable hierarchy that the question of how to address the situation had simply not previously arisen. It was discomfort and assessment, and something else underneath both of those things, something carefully armored, something he was not going to acknowledge all at once, in a face that had been trained by centuries of imperial responsibility to reveal nothing, and was revealing rather more than it intended. Marin looked back at him without flinching. She had over 14 years worked with creatures that could have killed her several times each. She had learned through that work that the fundamental dynamic between a frightened powerful thing and the person trying to help it did not change based on the size of the powerful thing. The scale was different. The Emperor's golden eyes contained depths and histories and something very close to grief that she had never seen in an animal's eyes before, and she registered that difference with the respectful attention it deserved. But the principle was the same. Large and powerful and frightened and trying not to show it, she understood this. She knew what to do with it. "You are the caretaker," he said, and his voice was a physical presence in the room, a deep resonance that did not so much travel through the air as simply exist in the chest of anyone within range of it, settling there without asking permission. "Marin Ashvel, your radiance." She kept her voice calm and even and direct because directness was what she always used, and because she suspected that a creature with 3 centuries of experience detecting the anxious deference of everyone around him would find straightforwardness more useful than performance. Animal caretaker, 14 years. Her eyes moved past him to the hatchery doors with the focused assessment of someone already beginning to work. "May I see them?" "You may feel them from here," he said, and something shifted behind the gold of his eyes, a movement, a restraint, something being held very carefully in place. Closer and... "I already felt it coming in," she said, not interrupting exactly, offering information. "From the corridor, maybe 50 feet out." She paused, and when she spoke again, her tone was the one she used when she needed a frightened creature to understand that she was telling it the truth and had no reason to lie, speaking to something very large and very worried that happened to be wearing the face of an emperor. "It doesn't hurt me, your radiance. It's more like pressure, like sound you feel in your sternum rather than hear with your ears. It's uncomfortable, it's manageable, I'd like to see what we're working with." The pause that followed was long in the way that only a very old creature's pauses are long, not merely silence, but the weight of accumulated time pressing down into the space where words would ordinarily go. "You understand," he said quietly, "that every dragon who has entered that room has had to be carried out." "I understand that," she said. "I'm not a dragon." She said it simply, without pride or bravado or any of the aggressive self-assertion that he might have expected from a human trying to prove something. She said it as plain fact, the way she might have said "I'm not a horse" or "I'm not made of glass," as an observation about the nature of things that she had assessed and found relevant and was offering in good faith. Something moved in his expression that was not quite hope. Hope was an emotion that 3 centuries of loss had taught him to treat with profound caution, to keep behind glass, to look at but not touch. What moved across his face was something adjacent to hope, something that had the shape of hope without daring to name itself that. Something careful and fragile and very, very old, like a flame that had survived a great deal of wind and was not yet certain it had survived this particular night, but had not quite gone out. He looked at her, this small, muddy, calloused human with the steady brown eyes and the kit bag over her shoulder, and the complete absence of any pretense that she was anything other than exactly what she was, and he stepped aside. He gestured toward the hatchery doors with one enormous, clawed hand, and the gesture was more careful than it needed to be, as if he was aware that the person he was gesturing toward was a great deal smaller than anything he was accustomed to directing, and did not want to overwhelm. Marin nodded once. She picked up her kit. She squared her shoulders in the small, private, habitual way she always did at the beginning of a difficult case, not performance, just the physical act of gathering herself, and she walked toward the doors. She pushed them open and stepped through, and the resonance hit her like cold water, a full-body surge of pressure and vibration and the strange, sourceless wrongness that the physician had tried and failed to describe. And it was bad, bad enough that her vision swam briefly at the edges, and she tasted something metallic at the back of her throat. She stood in the doorway and breathed. Slow, even, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the same rhythm she used when she was fighting nausea on horseback or managing pain in her hands during a difficult birth in the middle of winter. The hatchery opened before her, the gold-ribbed ceiling, the carved heating vents, the volcanic nest platform worn smooth by centuries of use that had not included the past 47 years, the warm mineral smell of heated stone, and at the center of all of it the 6 eggs, each one the size of a large barrel, their shells patterned in the deep shifting blacks and golds of the imperial line, their glow so faint now that she had to look carefully to confirm it was there at all. She stood there for a long moment, absorbing it all, letting the pressure resonance settle into her body's awareness from novelty into simply information, something present, something real, something to work with. Then she walked to the nest platform and crouched down at eye level with the nearest egg, and she looked at it the way she looked at every new patient, with complete and unhurried attention, as though nothing in the world existed outside this moment and this creature and the question of what it needed. "Hello," she said quietly. Because it always cost nothing. Because she always did it. Because she had learned 14 years and hundreds of difficult cases ago that the first thing you gave a creature in distress was not a solution but a presence, the simple, steady fact of someone arriving who was not afraid and was not leaving. The egg pulsed. Just once, a single, faint, disorganized flicker of light, like a heartbeat that had been interrupted mid-beat and found its way back. Marin went very still, and the expression on her face was not triumph or satisfaction or the professional's quiet vindication of a correct hypothesis. It was something simpler and older than any of those things. It was the expression of someone who has just heard, underneath everything, the small and certain sound of something that is still trying. She opened her kit. She began. Behind her, in the doorway he could not cross, Emperor Sorithix the Eternal watched the small human settle herself beside the nest with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. And he felt, for the first time in 3 weeks, the specific, unbearable relief of a thing that has been falling, realizing that something has, perhaps, caught the edge of it. He did not move, he did not speak. He held himself very still at the threshold of the room he could not enter, and he watched the human who could, and he did something that 3 centuries of sovereignty had given him almost no practice doing. He waited and he let himself hope. The Emperor's baby dragons were untouchable until a human caretaker did the unthinkable. Part 2: What the Dragon Emperor Could Not Do. The hatchery was a magnificent room made terrible by silence. It had been built for a different kind of moment entirely, for the noise and heat and overwhelming aliveness of new things entering the world. The ceilings vaulted high and were ribbed with inlaid gold that caught warmth from the heating vents below and threw it back as light, so that the whole room would glow during a hatching the way a lantern glows from the inside. The walls were lined with those same heating vents, carved over generations into the shapes of coiling dragons, ancestors perhaps, watching over their descendants' first breaths, and the central nest platform was layered volcanic rock worn smooth by centuries of tending claws and careful, enormous hands. The air was warm and carried the deep mineral smell of stone that has been heated for so long it has forgotten how to be cold. Everything about the room said welcome. Everything about the room said this is where life begins. And it was silent. It had been silent for 47 years. And the silence had a quality to it now, not peaceful, not restful, but wrong, the way the silence after a very loud sound is wrong, as though the room itself remembered what it was supposed to contain and found the absence unbearable. The 6 eggs sat in the center of the nest, and they were beautiful. Even now, even fatting, they were extraordinary, each one roughly the size of a large barrel, their shells patterned in the deep, shifting blacks threaded with veins of gold that marked them unmistakably as the Emperor's line, his blood made visible in every curve of their surfaces. They were the most beautiful things Marin had ever seen, and they were dying in the most beautiful room she had ever stood in. And she took exactly 5 seconds to acknowledge both of those things before she set her kit down and began to work. She did not touch them yet. She walked slowly around the nest with her hands clasped behind her back, taking her time, letting her eyes move over each egg in turn. She did this with every new patient, learned the shape of the situation before she acted inside it, because acting before you understood was how you made things worse instead of better, and she had learned that lesson young and retained it thoroughly. The pressure resonance was stronger here at the center of the room, a constant low vibration that she felt in her back teeth and behind her eyes and in the hollow of her throat, building on itself slightly with each complete circuit she made of the nest. But it was bearable. Unpleasant in the sustained, grinding way that a very loud room is unpleasant, the kind of discomfort that wears at you slowly rather than striking sharply, that requires management rather than simply endurance. She had worked in louder, she had worked in worse, she kept walking. Each egg was slightly different, she noticed. Not in size, they were remarkably consistent there, but in the quality of their dimming glow. 2 of them pulsed with some remaining regularity, a slow and labored rhythm like breathing through obstruction. 2 more held their light in a flat, static way that she didn't like, a stillness that felt less like stability and more like exhaustion. One was nearly dark, which made something tighten in her chest that she noted and set aside. And one, the one nearest to her starting position, the one that had pulsed when she'd said hello in the doorway, pulsed with a frequency that was different from the others. More frequent, more varied, more present somehow, as though whatever was inside was pushing against the walls of its situation with more energy than it had any right to still possess. She crouched down at eye level with that one first. "Hello," she said, quietly and without self-consciousness, the way she always said it, because it had always been her practice, and she saw no reason to abandon her practice simply because her current patient was the imperial offspring of a 300-year-old dragon sovereign instead of a sick goat. The egg pulsed, more strongly this time than it had in the corridor, a visible brightening, brief and unsteady, like a flame pushed sideways by wind that manages, against the odds, to right itself. Like something that had heard its name called from a very long distance and was trying, despite everything, to answer. Marin went very still. She stayed crouched with her arms resting on her knees and her eyes on the egg, and her mind doing the thing it did when something important was trying to surface, going quiet, going receptive, letting the information arrange itself rather than forcing it into shapes she'd brought with her. She had heard about resonance in animals. She knew about the frequencies that healthy creatures maintained in their bodies and projected outward, communications that existed below the threshold of hearing, but well within the threshold of knowing. Signals that told others of their kind whether a creature was safe or threatened, calm or in crisis. She had felt it herself, working with large herd animals. The way a frightened horse could make the whole stable uneasy without making a sound, the way a laboring mare's distress could communicate itself to the other horses in adjacent stalls until the whole barn was trembling. She understood resonance. She understood distress communication. And what these eggs were putting out, the frequency that sent centuries-old dragons fleeing and weeping and collapsing at the threshold, suddenly recontextualized itself in her mind with the specific crystalline clarity of a key finding a lock that had been waiting for it. It was not a turning. It was a recognition. They were not cursed. They were crying. They had been crying, she realized, for weeks, crying in the only language available to creatures that had not yet developed any other. And every dragon that had approached had been hit by that cry like a physical blow and had recoiled. And every recoil had been felt by the eggs as confirmation that whatever they feared was real, that the wrongness they sensed was genuine, that there was no safety coming, and so they had cried louder, and the louder they cried the faster the dragons fled. And the faster the dragons fled the more alone and frightened the eggs became, in a loop that had been tightening for 3 weeks with no one able to get close enough to break it. The one in front of her pulsed again, that same reaching, unsteady flicker. "I hear you," Marin said to the egg, to the room, to whatever was inside pushing against the shell and the silence and the fear. "I'm here, I'm not going anywhere." She reached into her kit and began to take inventory of what she had brought and what she would need to send for. And she started, quietly and without fanfare, to work. She came out of the hatchery 2 hours later with her field journal open in her hands and her mind already several steps ahead of the present moment, organizing itself into the shape of a plan. The Emperor and 3 of his senior advisors were waiting in the antechamber with the particular quality of stillness that very large, very powerful beings adopt when they are trying extremely hard not to appear as anxious as they are. It was not entirely successful. Sorithik stood nearest the hatchery doors with his wings folded at an angle that suggested he had been unfolding and refolding them repeatedly during the time she had been inside. Thessavorn, the chief administrator, was turned slightly toward the door with the posture of someone who had been listening for sounds through stone walls, and finding the silence worse than any sound would have been. The other 2 advisors stood back with the careful expressions of individuals who had decided that no expression was the safest expression and were maintaining this position with effort. All 4 of them looked at the door when it opened. All 4 of them looked at Marin. Nobody spoke for a moment that contained rather a lot. "Well," said Thessavorn, who was old enough and had served long enough that the diplomatic habit of waiting to be addressed had been replaced by the more pressing habit of needing to know things. Marin sat down on the bench along the antechamber wall, a long, low bench of carved stone that had almost certainly been placed there specifically for human visitors, given that every other surface in the room was scaled to draconic dimensions, and she laid her field journal open on her knee and ran her thumb down the notes she had made while sitting with the eggs. She took a breath. Then she looked up at the 4 enormous creatures waiting for her to tell them something useful, and she did. "They're not cursed," she said. "They're in distress. There's a difference, and the difference matters practically." She watched Thessavorn's expression shift fractionally toward something that was not quite relief and not quite belief, but was at least open to both. "Whatever frequency they're emitting," she continued, "it's a stress response. It's the biological equivalent of a distress call, the kind of signal that under normal circumstances would bring parent dragons running, would trigger care responses, would result in the eggs being tended and soothed and the source of the disturbance being addressed." She paused and looked at Sorithik specifically, because this next part was important and she needed him to follow it carefully. "But draconic biology experiences that signal as a threat rather than a call. You walk in, you feel the resonance, your nervous system registers it as wrongness, as danger, and your body responds accordingly. You emit your own distress signals. The eggs feel those signals and interpret them as confirmation that something is wrong, that the danger they've been broadcasting about is real. So they escalate, they broadcast harder, which makes your response worse, which makes their response worse. She closed her journal. It's a feedback loop, a closed one. No dragon can break it because every dragon is a component of it. The presence of draconic biology in that room makes the situation worse, not better, every single time. The silence that followed was the particular kind that occurs when something obvious in retrospect has just been stated for the first time, and everyone present is quietly recalculating every decision made over the preceding weeks in its light. "They're frightened," Sorithix said. The words came out differently than his other words had, not with the resonant authority of the imperial voice, not with the careful, controlled calm he had maintained through every conversation she had observed him in. They came out with difficulty, in the way that words come out when the person saying them is assembling the thought as they speak it, and finding the assembled thought harder to hold than the uncertainty that preceded it. The concept of his unhatched offspring, his children existing in shells in the room 20 feet away, being frightened, having been frightened for weeks, broadcasting their fear into a silence that had only answered with more fear. He was turning this over in his mind in real time, and what was on his face as he did it was not the Emperor's expression. It was something older and simpler and considerably more painful. "Very frightened," Marin said, and her voice was matter-of-fact but not unkind, the tone of someone who is delivering hard information as cleanly as possible, because that is the only respectful way to deliver it. "I believe something disturbed them early in the incubation, possibly the same frequency event that first alerted your staff to the problem. Whatever it was, it registered to them as a significant threat, and they've been in a heightened stress state since that point. Every subsequent attempt to approach them has compounded it." She paused, looking down at her notes briefly, then back up. "Have you tried talking to them?" The silence this time had a different texture, not the silence of recalculation, but the silence of a question landing somewhere it had never landed before. "They are not yet hatched," said one of the advisors carefully, in the tone of a being choosing words with considerable deliberateness. "Communication with unhatched eggs is not, that is, the accepted understanding is that pre-hatching cognition does not. Foals respond to voice in the womb," Marin said, without looking up from her journal where she was adding a note. "Lambs recognize their mother's call before they're 3 hours old. I have worked with cattle whose calves identified and moved toward the mother's specific low call within minutes of birth, minutes, not hours, which means the recognition had to have formed before birth, because there wasn't time for it to form after." She looked up then and she met Sorithix's eyes, which required a small, deliberate act of composure because they were very large and very golden and at this moment very entirely focused on her face. "Communication doesn't begin at birth. It begins well before birth. That isn't a dragon principle or a human principle, it's a biological one, it's simply how it works." She held his gaze steadily. "They have known for weeks that something is wrong. What they don't know, what no one has been able to tell them because no one has been able to get close enough, is that something is also right. That someone is here. That they are not alone in this." Sorithix was quiet. The quality of his quiet was different from the advisor's silence. It had depth to it, weight, the quality of a very large creature processing something that had struck it somewhere that mattered. "And how?" he said eventually, with a care in the phrasing that suggested he was genuinely asking rather than challenging. A distinction she had learned to hear, working with animals, and was glad to hear now. "Does one communicate that to a creature that cannot yet understand language?" Marin looked at him for a moment. At the enormous, ancient, powerful creature folded into the smallest version of itself it could manage, asking her, a muddy 26-year-old goat keeper from a village with no name on any map, how to reach his children. "You don't use language," she said. "You use calm, you use presence, you use the steady, consistent fact of someone being near who is not afraid and is not leaving." She paused. "That's all they need to know right now. That's the only message that matters, everything else comes later." She spent the next 3 days in the hatchery. She did not leave. She sent the soldiers for a cot and had it installed in the corner of the room nearest the nest, in a position where she could see all 6 eggs simultaneously from a prone position if she needed to. She had her meals brought to the door and collected them without discussion. She managed the pressure resonance the way she managed every sustained discomfort, by integrating it into the background of her awareness, giving it a fixed position in the landscape of her attention so that it was always known and never forgotten and therefore required no active management, which freed the rest of her focus for more important things. She learned the eggs. This was the first and most essential thing, always with any new case, any new animal, any new situation that required her to intervene. Learn the patient. Learn their rhythms and their particularities and the specific quality of their distress, because no two creatures were distressed in exactly the same way, and the treatment that worked for one would fail for another, and the only way to know the difference was to pay attention long enough to actually see what was in front of you rather than what you expected to find. She gave them names in the private shorthand of her field journal because it helped her track them and because it was her habit, and because she had found over 14 years that nomming a patient was a form of commitment. A small declaration that this particular creature was known and distinct and being seen specifically not as one of a group but as itself. First, she had named already the strong pulsing, most present one near the entry point of the nest, the one that had responded when she'd spoken in the doorway. First was the most vocal in the only vocabulary available, the one that seemed to push back against its fear with the most energy, and she watched it with a particular attention that was partly professional and partly something she would not have named out loud in any company. She called the next most active one Ember, for the quality of its glow, which had a warmth to it that the others lacked, a reddish undertone among the gold. The two still pulsing ones she called Tide and Current for the way they seemed to influence each other, brightening and dimming in loose tandem as though in conversation. The flat, exhausted one she called Stone not dismissively, but with the particular respect she gave to patients who were conserving everything, who had gone very deep and quiet and were spending nothing, surviving on reserves she couldn't measure. And the nearly dark one, the one that had made something tighten in her chest on first sight, she called Ember's Shadow, which was her private way of refusing to give up on it. You don't name a thing after what remains of light unless you believe the light is still there. She talked to them because that was the other thing, not instruction or information, nothing they could parse as language, just voice. The consistent, calm, present fact of a human voice in the room, carrying the specific frequency of someone who was not afraid and was not in pain and was not going anywhere. She talked about the goat with the broken leg, and about the village in the lowlands, and about the autumn she had spent working at a larger farm 3 provinces over, and the particular difficulties of convincing a bull to cooperate with a veterinary procedure. She talked about the shape of the mountain as they had approached it, and the quality of the light through the hatchery's high windows at different times of day. She talked about nothing specifically, which meant she was really talking about presence, about the continuous low, steady signal of I am here, I am here, I am here. She sang when she ran out of words, which happened on the second night when she had been awake for too many hours and her voice wanted something simpler than speech. Old songs from her childhood, harvest songs, songs that the older women in her village sang while they worked, melodies built for sustainability rather than performance, with a steady mid-tempo rhythm and a resolution at the end of every phrase. She had no particular singing voice. That was not the point. The point was the rhythm, the resolution, the predictable returning home of every melody to its tonic note. The musical equivalent of it is all right. Here is how all right sounds. Notice how this ends where it promised to end. Resolution was the message. Things resolve, things find their way back. This is what that sounds like. The eggs brightened by increments so small she had to record them systematically to be sure she wasn't imagining it. But she was not imagining it. The records were clear. By the end of the second day, Stone had begun to pulse again, faint, intermittent, not yet reliable, but present. By the morning of the third day, Ember's shadow held a glow that was visible from across the room, which it had not on the first. And first, steady, persistent, effortful first, held its light for a full 10 uninterrupted minutes on the afternoon of the third day, burning with a consistency that was, in the private emotional accounting that Marin kept separate from her field notes, one of the most satisfying things she had witnessed in 14 years of this work. She reported this to Sorothix that evening. She had developed a routine of brief evening reports, standing in the antechamber while the Emperor bent his vast frame as low as the space allowed, bringing those golden eyes to a height where the distance between them was marginally less enormous, and she talked through what she had observed and what she had done and what she planned for the following day. She kept the reports factual and specific because that was what she had, and because she had found that factual and specific was what he wanted, not reassurance, not softening but information, the actual state of things, which he was apparently perfectly capable of processing without having it prepared for him first. When she told him about first holding its light for 10 minutes, something happened to his face that no court artist had ever been positioned to capture, and that she suspected Sorothix himself was not entirely aware of. It was not the Emperor's expression. The Emperor's expression was a controlled, constructed thing, centuries of practice, centuries of necessity, the face of a creature that could not afford to be read. What crossed his face in the 2 seconds after she said 10 minutes without flickering was something that had nothing to do with sovereignty or strategy or the careful management of power. It was the unguarded, unarmored expression of a father who has been told that his child is still there, that after weeks of terrible silence and terrible distance and the particular anguish of being unable to help, his child is still there, still fighting, still reaching toward the light. He controlled it within 3 seconds, the mask reasserting itself with the practiced speed of long habit. But she had seen it. She filed it away alongside everything else she had learned about this particular patient, which was not the eggs but the Emperor, who was also in his way in distress, and who also needed someone to be steady in front of. "What do you need?" he said. "More time," she said. "A week, possibly two. They're stabilizing, but they're not stable. There's a difference, and I don't want to move faster than they're ready for." She paused. "And I'd like you to come to the doorway in the evenings. Not inside, the loop is still too fragile, and your presence in the room would undo what we're building before it was strong enough to hold against it. But near, at the threshold." She met his eyes. "They should know you're there. You are their parent. In the hierarchy of things they need to feel, your presence in that near distance is not optional. It matters." He did not argue, he did not qualify. He simply said, "Done," and came to the doorway that night. And every night after. He folded himself down as small as he could manage at the threshold, which was still very large, even small, and he sat at the boundary of the room he could not enter, and he spoke to his eggs in the old draconic tongue. Not the imperial common language that the provinces used, not the formal register of court address, but something older and lower and more resonant, something that seemed to come from deeper in his chest than ordinary speech, something that she could feel through the stone floor and through the soles of her boots as she worked among the eggs. She did not know the words. She did not need to know the words. The frequency was its own meaning. I am here, you are not alone, I am here. Each time he spoke, the eggs glowed a little brighter. Each time. Without exception, without diminishment, without the complicated variations that attended everything else in their recovery. Just a steady, reliable brightening, as reliable as sunrise, as the eggs heard their parents' voice at the edge of the world they could feel but not yet see. Marin watched this from across the nest, sitting with her back against the far wall, her field journal open on her knee, and she recorded what she observed with precision and care. And in the private accounting she kept separate from the journal, she noted something that would not have fit in any report. That the Emperor's voice, speaking in a language she did not understand, from a position at the edge of a room he could not cross, communicating with children who could not yet answer, that voice carried, in its frequency and its steadiness and its refusal to stop, everything that she had been trying to teach the eggs in 3 days of talking and singing and presence. "I am here, I am not afraid, I am not leaving." He had known how to say it all along. He had simply needed someone to open the door wide enough to say it through. She wrote in her journal, day 3, all 6 eggs brightening. Recommend continued protocol, prognosis improving. Then, below the professional notation, in smaller letters that were not part of any official record. "They know he's there, you can see it when he speaks. They know." The Emperor's baby dragons were untouchable until a human caretaker did the unthinkable. The unthinkable thing. On the 9th day, first began to hatch. Marin had not been sleeping, not properly, not in the way that constituted actual rest. She slept in fragments during difficult cases, always had, her body developing over 14 years the particular adaptive habit of dropping into brief, shallow unconsciousness and surfacing again without the slow, confused return to awareness that deeper sleep required. She slept the way a watchfire burns, low and consistent, always ready to flare. So when the change began in first egg at the deep hour of the night, the hour when the mountain was most quiet and the only sounds were the soft cycling of the heating vents and the ambient warmth of the room pressing against the high windows, she was awake to see it. She had been watching the egg for 2 hours before the first crack appeared. She had known something was building. The signs were ones she recognized from other births, not draconic birth specifically, because she had no experience with those but birth in general, which followed certain principles regardless of species with the reliable logic of deep biological law. The glow inside first shell had been intensifying since roughly the evening meal, not with the flickering, distressed quality that had characterized the egg's light in their worst days, but with something purposeful and building, like pressure accumulating behind a door. The frequency had shifted too, she could feel it in her chest, that particular pressure resonance she had been living inside for 9 days and had long since integrated into her awareness, and what it was doing now was different from what it had done before. It had changed rhythm. It had changed quality. Where the stress frequency had been ragged and irregular, a cry that went in all directions because it didn't know where to go, this was gathering itself, becoming directional. She had moved her cot and clothes and sat on the edge of it with her hands resting on her knees and her back straight and her whole attention forward. The way she sat at every birth, not tensed, not leaning, just present and ready, holding her own stillness carefully so as not to add any new noise to a moment that had its own music. She had sent a runner to wake the Emperor at the 20-minute mark when the frequency shift had become unmistakable. She had done it without deliberating, on the same principle that governed all her decisions about births. Parents should be present when it is possible for them to be present. Whatever the complications, and there were complications, significant ones, which she had not yet resolved and was holding in the background of her thinking while her foreground stayed entirely on the egg. Whatever those complications turned out to be, the attempt had to be made. Sorithix had sat at that threshold for 6 nights and spoken to his eggs in the old tongue that sounded like mountains. He had earned the right to be called when this moment came. The first crack appeared in first shell at the deepest point of the night. It did not announce itself dramatically. It was simply there, a hairline fracture running perhaps 4 inches along the shell's upper curve, so fine at first that Marin had to look twice to confirm she was seeing it and not imagining it out of attention and anticipation. Then it spread. Slowly, with a sound that was surprisingly intimate for something so significant, not a sharp splitting but a gradual tearing, deep and resonant, like heavy paper parting under controlled tension. The sound of something that has decided it is time and is proceeding at its own pace regardless of whether the world is ready. A second crack followed the first, running perpendicular, and then a third branching from the junction between them, and the whole shell surface around the fracture point began to move infinitesimally at first. A slight bowing outward, a shift in the way the light came through from inside as something pressing from within found the weakness and used it. Then a sound that was not quite a sound at all. A surge in the pressure resonance, a concentrated, full-bodied wave of it that hit Marin in the chest like a flat palm and pushed her breath backward in her lungs and made her eyes water sharply, the way eyes water when exposed to sudden bright light rather than when they are producing tears from emotion. She registered it, catalogued it, did not move. She had expected something like this. Births were frequently loud in frequencies she couldn't hear. A tiny clawed foot punched through the shell. It came through at the largest fracture point, with the triumphant and slightly outraged energy of something that has been working toward this moment for a very long time and has opinions about how long it has taken. The foot was dark, nearly black, the same deep obsidian as the Emperor's scales, and it was startlingly small, a perfect miniature of what it would eventually be. Each tiny claw precise and complete, glistening with the moisture from inside the egg and curling reflexively against the open air of the room as though testing it, finding it strange, deciding provisionally to proceed. Marin exhaled, slowly and deliberately and completely, the way she exhaled at every birth at this precise moment, not because she had been holding her breath, but because something in her body required the acknowledgement of what it had just witnessed. Something that needed to be marked even quietly, even privately. There you are, she thought, not out loud. Just in the place behind her expression where she kept the things that belonged to her and not to the professional record. There you are, hello, well done, there you are. First one's hatching, she said aloud, not turning around, her eyes staying on the egg because the egg was where her attention was required. She said it for the benefit of whoever had arrived at the door. She had heard the vast, careful tread of something very large settling into position outside the hatchery before she spoke. The particular careful quality of footsteps that knew they had to stop at a threshold and were stopping there with everything they had. I can see. Sorithix's voice came from the doorway, and it was different from every other time she had heard it. It was stripped entirely of the imperial register of the resonant authority, the careful controlled weight, the centuries-deep steadiness he maintained in every public moment and most private ones. What came through the door in those 3 words was something that had no rank and no title, and was not performing any function except existing in this moment. Witnessing this thing, being a father at the edge of the room where his firstborn child was arriving in the world. She did not look back, she did not need to. She heard it, registered it, filed it, and kept her eyes on the egg. First was struggling. This was the thing that the theoretical accounts of birth never adequately conveyed, the work of it. The sheer effortful labor from both sides of the threshold. The fact that the most natural thing in the world is also one of the most difficult. The hatchling inside the shell was fighting for every inch of progress, working against the remaining shell with a dogged, exhausting, wholly characteristic energy that Marin recognized because she had been watching First Energy for 9 days and this was it. This was exactly it, the same refusal to stop, the same directional persistence, pushing not because it was easy but because it was necessary and First had apparently decided some time ago that necessary was sufficient reason. But it was tiring. She watched the pauses between efforts lengthen, 2 seconds, 4 seconds, 6 seconds, the hatchling conserving, gathering, spending again. She watched the movement inside the shell become fractionally less coordinated as the muscles behind it began to reach the edge of their resources. She made the calculation that she made at every birth, the one that nobody could teach you to make and that no written guideline could substitute for, the calculation that lived in 14 years of accumulated judgment and nowhere else. Is this normal struggle or is this too much? The pauses were lengthening. Is this nature working or nature requiring assistance? The movements were losing their coordination. She knew the answer. She had known the answer for approximately 30 seconds, which was exactly as long as it had taken her to be certain enough to act on. Certainty was not the same as speed. Rushing to a conclusion was how you got the wrong one. But she was certain now, and certainty meant it was time. She reached forward and placed both hands flat against first shell. The frequency hit her the way a wave hits someone who has been standing in shallow surf and is unprepared for the depth. A full-body surge of cold pressure vibration that came up through her palms and traveled through her arms and hit her chest from the inside, and made her vision swim at the edges with a white-gray static that she recognized as neurological overload, and filed under manageable with the efficient clinical detachment of someone who has decided in advance what category this falls into and does not have time to renegotiate that categorization. Her nose began to bleed, which she noticed the way she noticed the cold or the hour as information about her current situation, nothing more. She heard from the doorway a sound. It might have been a sharp intake of breath. It might have been the beginning of her name. She kept her hands on the shell. "It's all right," she said, and her voice was exactly the voice she had been using in this room for 9 days, calm and present and unhurried, the voice that said, "I am here and I am not afraid, and this is not the end of anything. This is a beginning and I am going to be here for it." She said it to the hatchling inside the shell. She said it to the emperor at the threshold. She said it to the room which had been waiting 47 years for something worth saying it to. "I've got you." She pressed her palms against the shell and felt for what she needed to find. This was the skill beneath the skill, not strength, not speed, not even knowledge exactly, but attunement, the ability to feel through her hands what was happening inside what she was touching, to read the shell the way she would read the tension in a laboring animal's muscles, and find in that reading the information she needed to act correctly. She found the hairline fractures, the places where the shell was already committed to giving way, already partway through the process, requiring not force but direction. The right pressure, the right angle, the acknowledgement of what was already happening, and the gentle, graduated assistance of helping it happen the rest of the way. You don't do the work for them, you do the work with them. This was the whole of the philosophy distilled. 14 years, hundreds of births, every difficult case she had ever worked with them, not for them. You bring your strength to bear alongside theirs in service of what they are already trying to do. You do not impose, you assist. The distinction sounds small. In practice, it is the difference between a birth and a damage. She applied pressure at the fracture points, carefully, graduated, listening through her hands for the moment when the shell would tell her she had found the right angle. The shell gave. It gave all at once, the way things give when they have been ready to give for longer than they have been held together, with a kind of relief that Marin could feel through her palms as the resistance simply ceased. And first tumbled out of the breaking shell in a rush of warmth and sudden unfolding wings. Wings that spread instinctively, automatically, the body knowing what it needed to do even before the mind had any framework for understanding what wings were for, and landed in Marin's arms with a weight and momentum that buckled her elbows and drove her backward on the cot with a controlled impact that she absorbed through her core and her legs and her determination. And she caught the hatchling, and she adjusted. And she stabilized. And she held on with the practical competence of someone who has caught a great many unexpected weights in her career and has gotten good at it. The pressure resonance at this proximity was extraordinary. It was inside her now as much as around her, a vibration that resonated in her bones and behind her eyes and filled her chest with a pressure that was just short of pain, just short, and staying there, and she stayed with it the same way she stayed with everything, present, managing here. First was alive, small and dark and still slick from the egg, trembling with the profound full-body effort of having just done the most difficult thing it would ever do, trembling with the cold of the open air and the strangeness of light and the overwhelming newness of a world that had, until approximately 45 seconds ago, been entirely theoretical. A face, an actual face, complete and particular and already individual, with the high bone structure of the imperial line rendered in miniature and a jaw that had the same set to it that Sorithix's jaw had when he was thinking carefully about something. 2 wings, damp and folded and considerably larger in proportion to the body than Marin had expected. 4 limbs, each one ending in those precise dark claws. A tail wrapped instinctively around Marin's wrist with the reflexive grip of something that does not yet know what it is holding, but knows it needs to hold something. And 2 eyes. Half open still, blinking against the light with the specific bewildered expression of a creature that has just learned that light is a thing that exists and is not yet sure how it feels about this information. Golden eyes, the same gold as the Emperor's, deep and warm and currently containing none of the centuries of complexity that lived in the Emperor's gaze. Only the pure, unencumbered astonishment of something that has never seen anything before and is seeing everything for the first time. Those eyes moved. They searched not randomly, but with the purposeful searching of a creature looking for something specific, something known, something it could recognize in this incomprehensible new world. They moved across Marin's shoulder and found her face. And stopped. First went still in her arms. Not the stillness of exhaustion, she knew that stillness. It was different, but the stillness of recognition. The stillness of a creature that has been listening to a voice in the dark for 9 days and has just found the face the voice belonged to. Hello, Marin said. It was what she always said. It was what she had always said to every creature she had ever met at the beginning of their life in the open air. It cost nothing. It mattered more than anything more sophisticated she could have offered. Her voice did not shake. She had not expected it to, but she noted with quiet private satisfaction that it didn't. She was allowed to note that. First made a sound, very small and very new and entirely its own, not the resonant, multi-layered complexity of adult draconic speech, nothing like what she heard from Sorithix when he spoke at the doorway in the old tongue, but a small and uncertain and wholly genuine inquiry. A question directed outward from a creature that did not yet know what questions were, toward the particular face it had identified as the face that answered them. It said in no language, in the universal language that lives below language, is it you? Are you the one? Are you real? That's right, Marin said, and her voice was warm and steady and completely certain. I'm here, I've been here, I'm still here. First's tail tightened around her wrist. She was pressing the back of her hand against her nose when Sorithix came through the door. Every courtier who witnessed it later, the 3 advisors who had been waiting in the antechamber, the 2 soldiers stationed at the outer corridor, the runner who had been sent to wake the emperor and had followed him back out of a helpless need to see how it ended. Every one of them would spend years afterward trying to find language adequate to describe what they saw, and every one of them would fail in ways they found instructive. It was not the entrance of the emperor of the Draconic Imperium. That was the essential, irreducible, impossible to convey fact of it. That was what defeated every attempt at description. He crossed the threshold that had defeated him for weeks, that the pressure resonance had made impassable, that his own biology had turned into a wall, crossed it with his scales pulled taut across his body, and his eyes streaming freely and every muscle in his vast frame shaking with the compound effort of moving forward into something that was trying very hard to push him backward. He was shaking visibly. Sorithix the Eternal, sovereign of 11 provinces and 3 centuries, was shaking like something that has never been tested this way before and has not yet found the bottom of what it can endure and keeps going anyway. He walked across the hatchery floor. He reached the nest platform. He sank down onto it with the controlled heaviness of a very large creature that has used most of what it had to get to this particular place and has arrived at the exact right moment, which was the only moment that mattered. He looked at his hatchling, dark and small and alive in the arms of a human woman with blood on her upper lip and absolute steadiness in her brown eyes, and the expression on his face had no name in any language Marin knew. It did not require one. It required only witnessing. She gave it a moment. She was good at giving things the moment they required. The bleeding, he said, and gestured toward her nose with one claw held at the extreme of its care, as careful as she had ever seen anything be careful. It's fine, she said, it's stopping. It happens sometimes with pressure differentials, nothing structural. You should have, he began and stopped and started again. There should have been some way to. She needed help more than I needed to not have a bloody nose, Marin said, simply. Without heat, without drama, without any of the self-conscious weight that a statement of sacrifice tends to carry when the person making it wants credit for it. She said it the way she said everything that was simply true, as information about the state of things offered for accuracy rather than effect. She had looked at the situation. She had made a calculation. The calculation had come out one way. That was the whole of it, and she had no interest in expanding it into a more complicated story. Sorithix looked at her for a long time. It was a different kind of looking than he had done before, not the assessing look of the first meeting, not the watchful look of the antechamber reports. He was looking at her the way you look at something you are trying to fully understand and suspect you will need a great deal more time to manage it. Then he looked at his hatchling. At the small dark creature breathing slowly and steadily in Marin's arms, apparently entirely disinclined to be relocated, one tiny clawed foot curled around 2 of Marin's fingers with the confident possessiveness of something that has decided where it belongs and sees no reason to be argued out of it. Then back at Marin's. What you did, he said, reaching into that resonance, placing your hands directly on the shell when it was, he stopped, started again. No dragon has ever. I know, she said. You knew what it would do to you, you knew before you reached. I knew it wouldn't kill me, she said, and the distinction in those words was precise and intentional, and she meant every syllable of it exactly. The resonance isn't lethal to human biology. I'd established that in the first hours, damaging at close contact possibly, painful certainly, not lethal. She glanced briefly at her nose, which had indeed stopped bleeding, and back at him. That was sufficient information to act on. You calculated. It was tipping the wrong way, she said. I waited as long as I could wait and then I acted. That's the work. She said it without a single note of heroism in her voice because she did not experience it as heroism. She experienced it as the application of judgment to a situation that required judgment, which was what she did. That's just the work. The silence that followed was long and full and very still, and somewhere behind them the second egg was making the first sounds of its own beginning, faint cracking, gathering itself. The same building frequency she had felt in first 6 hours ago. Marin Asheville, said the Emperor of the Draconic Imperium. He said her name the way he had said very few things in their entire acquaintance, without any of the layers of governance and authority and 3 centuries of practiced control sitting on top of it. Just the name plainly, with the weight of what he meant by saying it resting in the saying rather than in any elaboration. I am not accustomed to owing debts to humans. You don't owe me a debt, she said. She looked down at First, who was looking back at her with those half-open golden eyes that had found her face and apparently decided they were done looking anywhere else for the foreseeable future. The tiny clawed foot tightened incrementally around her fingers. She needed care. I provide care, that's what this is, there's no ledger in it. Nevertheless, Sorathix said, and the word carried the particular finality of a creature that has made a decision and will not be argued out of it by reason or deflection or the admirable stubbornness of the person it is directing the decision toward. You will stay. For as long as you are willing to remain, you will have whatever you require, whatever the work requires, whatever you require, without limit and without condition. He paused, and when he continued, his voice had shifted into a lower register, a register she associated with the old tongue he used at the doorway, something that came from deeper than ordinary speech. And these 6, my children, all 6 of them will know your name. They will know it from the beginning as one of the first things they know, before they know the provinces, before they know the history of our line, before they know their own titles. His golden eyes were steady and direct and entirely serious. Your name will be among the first words they learn. That is not a debt. That is the truth of what you are to them. Marin sat with this for a moment. She was not unaffected by it, she would have been lying to claim otherwise, and she was not a person who lied. But she sat with it in the private way she sat with things that were too large for immediate processing, setting it carefully to the side to be understood later in the quiet. She looked at First, at the small, perfect, extraordinary face looking back at her with the complete, uncomplicated certainty of a creature that has not yet learned that trust is complicated. She thought about the village that barely appeared on maps, and the goat with the broken leg who would be fine. She had left thorough instructions. The neighbor knew the signs to watch for, the leg would heal clean. She thought about 14 years of work in difficult conditions with frightened creatures and uncertain outcomes, and the particular texture of the satisfaction that came when the work went right. Not the applause, because there was never applause, but the actual thing itself. The moment when the creature breathed and lived and looked at you, and you had been part of that. She thought about what it would mean to do that work here, in this room, with these 6, watching them grow from the creatures she was currently holding and tending to the creatures they would eventually become. She thought about what it would mean to be the person they knew first. I'll need a proper cot, she said. This one's adequate for short-term use, but the frame is wrong for anyone planning to actually sleep in it, and if I'm staying long-term, I need to actually sleep. She glanced at the nearest heating vent, east wall, where the airflow had been bothering her since the second day. And someone needs to fix the east vent. The airflow distribution is uneven, I've been compensating manually, but once they're mobile, that's going to create temperature differentials in the nest that will cause problems. That needs to be properly addressed. She looked back at him. And a supply line for the herbs in my kit, I'll write you a list. Some of them will need to come from the lowlands, you won't have them here. Sorathix made a sound. It moved through the room and through Marin's chest and through the walls and quite possibly through the stone of the mountain itself. And the courtiers in the antechamber looked at one another with the expressions of people encountering something they have no established category for. It was a sound that no living being present had heard from him before. It was a sound that the court historians, consulting their records later, would find no precedent for in 300 years of documented imperial behavior. It was unmistakably a laugh, not a polite sound, not a controlled performative acknowledgement of something amusing. A real laugh surprised out of him by the specific, perfect, characteristic merriness of what she had just said, by the fact that she had just been offered the equivalent of an imperial title and a permanent position in the most significant household in the Draconic Imperium, and her immediate response had been the cot is inadequate and the vent needs fixing. Done, he said when he had recovered himself, and there was something in his voice that had not been there at the beginning of their acquaintance. Something that had come from the other side of fear, from the other side of 9 days and a threshold and a small human with steady hands and blood on her lip, holding his firstborn child like it was the most natural thing in the world, because for her it was. Behind them, the second egg cracked open in a cascade of golden light that filled the room from its center outward, warm and sudden and entirely unambiguous, the light of something that had decided it was time and was arriving accordingly. Marin shifted first in her arms with the practiced adjustment of someone accustoming herself to a new weight and a new balance, both of which she would spend years learning, and found she did not mind in the least. She held the small dark creature carefully, securely, specifically this particular creature, this one whose name she had given in her private notes and whose stubbornness she had watched for 9 days and recognized like something she already knew. She passed first with deliberate care into Sorithix's waiting hands. Enormous hands, trembling very slightly, for reasons entirely unconnected to the resonance. Hands that received what she offered with a reverence and a terror, and a love that required no interpretation. Then Marin Asheville, keeper of difficult cases, turner of frightened things toward calm, knower of the difference between waiting and acting, stood up from the cot and turned toward the second egg and went to meet whoever was arriving. In the imperial records of Veilthorn, the hatching of Emperor Sorithix's first clutch is recorded as the most significant event of his 300-year reign. The record is detailed and precise. The date, the hour, the names of those present in official capacity, the names of all 6 hatchlings as designated by the Emperor in the days that followed. The names of 6 dragons are listed in the formal imperial script, black ink on white stone, permanent in the way that only things carved into mountain are permanent. Below them, in a different hand, a smaller hand, a human hand, added at the Emperor's specific and explicit direction, is a 7th entry. Marin Asheville, keeper of the Imperial Clutch, present at the beginning of all 6. She is the only human in the record. She is the only non-draconic name in 300 years of Imperial documentation. She is the only name the Emperor insisted be included. He dictated the entry himself. He specified the placement below the 6 connected to the 6 part of the 6. He specified the language. When the court historian suggested delicately that a separate human record might be more appropriate to the existing organizational structure, the Emperor looked at the historian for a long moment with those golden eyes that contained centuries. "She was there," he said. "She is in the record." The historian recorded it exactly as directed. In the hatchery, 6 young dragons grew. They learned their names and the history of their line and the geography of 11 provinces and the weight and responsibility of what they were. And they learned, first among all of it, before provinces and history and the meaning of their own titles, a human name. They knew it the way they knew warmth, the way they knew the voice that had been there in the dark before they had eyes to see by. They knew it the way you know the first thing you ever knew.